Great. Well, thank you very much, Rosemary, for that kind introduction. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Old Town Association and Naomi Richardson for the invitation to speak to you this evening, and to say another thank you to Rosemary again for helping out with all the technology. And so this talk today combines really the twin themes of maps and Edinburgh, which, as you might imagine, are both very close to my heart. And it's always nice to have the opportunity to look at these. And as you might expect me to say as well, maps, I think, are wonderful things, illuminating as artifacts, vital as historical resources, and indispensable for us in all sorts of everyday contexts. And I feel Edinburgh, too, for many of its residents who live here or work here, is one of the world's great cities. But there are hundreds and hundreds of maps of Edinburgh and many different stories that can be told with them. And so what I thought I would do this evening is focus on some of the most important maps that have been used to plan future developments. And we will look at maps specifically connected to what we might call plans, blueprints, and projected schemes, many of which were either not fully implemented or they were altered in significant ways. And I'm trying, where possible, to focus very much on the Old Town. So what we'll do is take these chronologically, which I think is the easiest way of understanding them, and following a brief look at military maps of the castle esplanade area. We'll begin with the various plans then for constructing the new town. Then we'll look at South Bridge in the later 18th century, before then looking at constructing eastern approaches to the new town via Calton Hill. The various plans, many different plans for the western approaches to the Old Town and to George IV Bridge environs dominated the early 19th century. And then the Edinburgh Improvement Act of 1867 unleashed dramatic alterations to the central Old Town. We'll look briefly at some of Patrick Geddes' plans and developments in the later 19th century, before finishing with some of the grand designs of Patrick Abercrombie in the mid-20th century. And in passing, we'll look at some of the background to these plans and how some of the driving motivations behind them changed over time. And grand projects and master plans rely on strong centralized control over urban space. So this slide is an interesting slide by W. and A.K. Johnston from 1885. And it shows really the ownership of land that was administered by the town council, which in 1767 was just the darker colored areas at the higher end of the Royal Mile. And the large yellow colored area to the north was predominantly acquired in 1767. And then the blue areas further beyond during the 19th century. So 1767 and then 1809 for most of the yellow area. But there were important exceptions that influenced developments. For example, the Earl of Moray's land at the western end, or the village and barony of Broughton, as well as the area around Heriots and Greyfriars, which were not in the control of the council until much later. Westport, Tollcross and Bristow weren't formally annexed in this area, the blue area, until 1856. And this caused serious complications, as we'll see, for the Western approach plans. And so with this in mind, really, it's useful to be aware that the centralized planning that became possible by the later 19th century across a wide swathe of Edinburgh was not possible for the town council before this time period. So at the head of the old town, Edinburgh Castle steadily grew over time, and by the late 17th century had become steadily keener on expanding over the esplanade and towards the residential buildings on Castle Hill. And this is unimplemented, but quite architecturally splendid design by Captain John Sletzer, the first chief engineer in Scotland, who, amongst other things, published his Theatrum Scotiae volume of views of palaces, castles, and abbeys. And internationally at this time, the advances in the destructive power, particularly of mobile artillery, rendered the medieval defenses of the castle largely obsolete, and there was a steadily growing fear of the threat and reality of Jacobite rebellion and insurrection. And Sletzer's successor as chief engineer, who's called Theodore Jury, and the second engineer in Great Britain, Talbot Edwards, produced much more detailed plans for building a projecting defensive feature, what they called a hornwork, right across the present-day esplanade. These plans were in the early 18th century. And this plan is orientated with west at the top, so we can see part of the surviving castle buildings here at the top and the residential buildings at the top of Castle Hill down here at the bottom. And the new projected artillery defenses are sketched on in green and in yellow. The stamp, which you can see upside down here, is of the Inspector General of Fortifications, which is effectively the British Military Board of Ordnance, who had responsibility for British defences. And this was very much a confidential military map drawn up for army authorities. Theodore Jury called his plan Le Grand Secret, and work actually began on constructing a small section of the northern wall over on this side before funds ran out and priorities changed. And this wall is still partly visible today in Princes Street Gardens. But it's an interesting military might have been, which would have effectively completely obliterated the esplanade and nearby housing. So we now travel further down the Royal Mile and on in time to continue our story with William Edgar's map of 1742, the first overhead plan of Edinburgh, showing this central part of the old town, really on the brink of change and expansion. And Edgar worked for the Board of Ordnance too, as a military surveyor. He died near Fort Augustus in 1745, and his plan of Edinburgh survives today through its inclusion in the standard history book of Edinburgh of its day by William Maitland. And we're lucky in having a revised version of Edgar's map from 2 decades later, showing the new Royal Exchange and the plans for North Bridge. So the original Edgar plan is on this left-hand side and the revised Edgar plan on the right. And in map making, it was always easier to correct a map engraved on copper by hammering out small detail and revising it rather than creating a completely fresh map. And the updated Edgar map shows a number of new buildings with slightly bolder outlines, as well as demolished ones, which were often only partly erased. And 1752 is this important year when the highly influential town council publication was issued entitled Proposals for Carrying Out Certain Public Works in the City of Edinburgh. And in addition to reiterating the pressing need that there was then for new buildings, it advocated the draining of the Nor Loch, and the construction of a building for merchants on the north side of the High Street. And we can see the results of this in the newly constructed Royal Exchange buildings completed in 1761. Further down the High Street, this area that was marked by pecked lines and the letter R here indicates the intended course of the first North Bridge. The foundation stone for the bridge had been laid in 1763, but there were a number of difficulties surrounding its construction, and in all it took nearly a decade to complete. So we move north, and although James Craig's rectangular grid plan for the new town eventually won the day, there were many alternative plans for the development of Edinburgh's new town. And these had really been put forward at different times over the previous century. This map is deceptively believable at first glance as a record of the 1760s landscape around Edinburgh, but on closer scrutiny, it shows a number of projected and unrealized features. Whilst its depiction of the old town that we can see here is in fact bang up to date, with no Netherbow port blocking the high street. It had been removed just a couple of years earlier. It also anticipates a number of developments, including George Square, which was actually only planned at this time. And likewise, the old Queensferry Road from the Grassmarket to Drum's Heugh is shown up here attractively speckled with buildings, which seems implausible given their absence from significant maps in the 1780s and 90s, which we'll look at in a moment. And John Laurie was a local land surveyor. He was a geographer, a teacher of mathematics. And from 1763, he drafted a number of maps of Edinburgh and the environs around Edinburgh. He worked with the town council and, amongst other commissions, produced some site plans for the original North Bridge. And it's been argued on good evidence that what we're looking at here is leaked information that Laurie gained access to due to his connections in the town council. And one of the most obvious features, of course, is the striking outline for the new town, named up here as New Edinburgh, including a central square and these bold diagonal streets forming a Union Jack shape. And though, as we know, the flag-like plan was not executed, the new town project was inherently unionist in conception, both architecturally and politically. So we can appreciate the graphical appeal of this. In fact, many of the Edinburgh plans, including some of those we're going to look at for the century from the 1750s through to the 1850s, were with quite a significant unionist agenda driving them in terms of their financing and their wider objectives in terms of improving communications, trade and commerce within the British economy. As we know, James Craig's plan was judged the winning entry for the design of the new town in August 1766, but the judging committee agreed that it required further work. And Laurie's plan, illustrated here, was published in August 1766. It seems likely to have been based on the winning plan submitted by Craig. But Craig's work was problematic, not least in that the central square, as we can see here, was really at the crown of where the Newtown Ridge was sharpest. And perhaps Craig purged his initial plan of some of these weaker points, replacing it with the world famous adopted version with a much simpler grid outline and a square at either end. Laurie, for his part, brought out a revised version of his plan in October 1766, showing the new town broadly as it actually developed. But Craig's plan was, in fact, substantially altered over the coming years, not least in fairly simple things in terms of the names of some of the streets and the squares. But there are also earlier manuscript versions of Craig's plan. This one is from the Museum of Edinburgh, showing a circus at the junction of George Street and Frederick Street, which is another interesting might have been. In the 1770s, Craig went on to design the Physicians' Hall on George Street, as well as St. James's Square. But his 1786 plan and profile for the development of Southbridge area was not adopted. This plan was really very impressive in scope, orientated with west at the top. This is North Bridge coming across here, and the Royal Mile, and then extending further down to the university, with an octagonal square around the Tron and the circular crescent meeting South Bridge. But it would have involved very substantial demolition of buildings, which is one of the main factors against it. And by this time, by the 1780s, the focus of development have moved very much south of the Royal Mile, with the construction of South Bridge, over 1,000 feet long and carried on 22 arches. And although alternative proposals have been put forward to bridge the Cowgate, the completion of North Bridge in 1772 provided the obvious line to take to the south. And the scheme was vigorously promoted by James Hunter Blair after he became Lord Provost in 1784. This view, this side-by-side comparison from our website between Alexander Kincaid's map on the left-hand side from 1784 and John Ainsley's map on the right from 1804 shows very much the new South Bridge ploughing through. And following the necessary Act of Parliament, the foundations of South Bridge were laid by 1785, and work was completed amazingly fast, only 3 years later in 1788. And along with its adjacent buildings, the bridge involved the demolition of all of these wines and closes running off the high street. And if we look back at the plan we just saw before, there were also dilemmas over the angle of some of the new roads that would be created around the Tron. So moving on, this 1793 plan of the city of Edinburgh was very much a foldable, pocket-sized work, particularly for visitors. And Thomas Brown and James Watson were both independent booksellers and stationers and members of the Edinburgh Booksellers Society. And they were based initially in Parliament Close in the 1780s, but they moved to the newly constructed bridges in the 1790s. And further to the south on this plan, we can see Robert Adams' original planned layout for Edinburgh University's Old College, at this time only partly built on its eastern side. And Adam had put forward alternative and grandiose proposals both for South Bridge and the college, which were not adopted, but he apparently successfully sued the city for costs, and in the end was awarded the college architectural work, but with a new brief. And the plan here shows how it included these two courtyards. An eastern oblong was for the professors, and then the western square was for the library, museum, graduation hall, and teaching rooms, with a chapel in between. But Adam died in 1793, the year this map was published. Further work was delayed until 1815 due to the financial stresses of the Napoleonic Wars, and as we know, executed to quite a different pattern. So now we move further north to the Colton Hill area, and complex patterns of land ownership, as well as the fact that two of the large landowners in this area were trusts, often delayed development, and ambitious plans had been drawn up by William Playfair to develop the Colton New Town to the east of Leith Walk in the following decade. These were largely not carried out in practice. Splendid though they looked on paper, what we're looking at here is the Colton Hill at this end and Leith Walk running down in this direction with a very fine array of streets and circuses and squares meeting one another. And although building started promptly, and some map makers were beguiled by these wonderful plans and included them in their own maps, a nice example of that is Robert Scott's map of Edinburgh here from 1822. And we can see here this fantastic latticed arrangement of streets that were very much only on paper at this time. This is one of a number of plans at this time that depict quite false townscapes and a number of difficulties stalled development of this whole area north of Colton Hill until the 1860s, by which time they were executed to quite a different pattern. But the period really at the end of the Napoleonic Wars from 1815 was very much one of increasing optimism. And the town council very much encouraged wider development and construction work on the back of growing prosperity and trade. And Robert Kirkwood's wonderful plan of the whole Edinburgh environs of 1817 very nicely juxtaposes new plan developments in outline form and sometimes in pink against the reality of existing buildings. So if we look at these two details here on the left-hand side, this is the Pleasance area just to the south of Drummond Street. These are all very much proposed buildings on streets that I believe were largely carried out to plan. But further over here on the right-hand side, we're looking down at the bottom end of the Canongate and the canals that sweep both underneath and acrossways to the north. And you see at this time in 1817, one of these planned developments very much focused around the Union Canal that had been authorized in this year. And there were various rival proposals by different engineers, some for it to terminate in Leith. And Robert Stevenson had submitted two more northerly routes to Leith, one running really along the water of Leith, taking a course through Princes Street Gardens, very much along the lines of the future railway. And then the canal turned to the north on the east side of Colton Hill. Stevenson's rival, meanwhile, John Rennie, proposed a more southerly route through Morningside and the Meadows, and then his route turned north, and we see it coming into view here running under the Canongate and then joining a similar route to Stevenson's. As we know, neither was in fact adopted, and instead Hugh Baird's route, really the central of the three routes further west terminating in Port Hopetoun, was approved and completed in 1822. So with Northbridge and Southbridge very much settled in, allowing residents and visitors to traverse Edinburgh's challenging topography, the need for the need for a straight and wide bridge from east and west became a priority. And Robert Stevenson, who we have just met, whose work encompassed lighthouses, canals, harbours and railways, was directly responsible for the design and construction of Edinburgh's Regent Road and the dramatic Regent Bridge in Waterloo Place, as we can see here. And this is a small part of this very large hand-drawn plan, probably produced for the town council. And if we go a little further west with this, we can see too, in the Lawn Market, Cowgate area and High Street, various dashed lines for proposed streets that Stevenson continued to argue for. One taking a more gradual ascent from the Grassmarket up to the High Street, and another longer route curving behind the Parliament House and up to the Tron. And Stevenson was keen really on developing routes that had more gradual gradients, and in fact more gradual routes than those that were eventually adopted. This is another Stevenson plan here, a slightly smaller scale plan. So this looks at the High Street and St Giles and the Grassmarket here. And we see the streets that we saw before from the Grassmarket, a proposed George IV Bridge Street, another street curving up to the Tron, and then an interesting street on the north side at the High Street, going round the back, if you like, going round the north side of the Bank of Scotland to curve down to the Mound. Meanwhile, further west, other approaches in towards the Grassmarket were also proposed, but land ownership in this area and the complexities of it continued to stall development. That's just looking in a bit more detail at those Stevenson streets in this area. And we're keeping in mind, as we see, in fact, an echo of this route a little later on. This plan is a rare early example of a map on the front of a newspaper showing the proposed plans in 1825 for what became Victoria Street and George IV Bridge. But as we can see here, at this time, the George IV Bridge plan was intended to split into two to curve up to a straight and what would have been quite dramatic descent from the Lawn Market area to meet the Mound directly. In the end, there were so many proposals around the Western approach. I'm just selecting a few here. In the end, Thomas Hamilton's scheme was approved by an Act of Parliament in 1827, but in fact, more than a decade passed before these roads were implemented, and not quite along the lines proposed here, especially for the route that would become Johnston Terrace over here further west. And one of the most important private surveyors of maps during this period was John Wood. And as with so many maps at first glance, it all looks very recognizable and perhaps an accurate reflection of what was there. But in an effort to try and give his map a longer shelf life by anticipating proposed developments, we in fact get quite an interesting juxtaposition of reality with future plans. So looking at this plan, we see, projected streets in the Orchard Field estate to the east of the Lothian Road and going up to Castle Terrace. What would become Johnston Terrace is sketched in, but not in the correct alignment with King's Bridge, whilst Victoria Street and George IV Bridge, which we can see in more detail with this inset, are shown at least a decade before their construction and not quite along the right lines. North of Old College here, this is an interesting street that was proposed, anticipating in some ways the route of Chamber Street by at least half a century, but was never constructed and shown very much in just the same style as all of the real streets that we know were there. And before we move on, it's interesting too to glance briefly at the developing mound over this time. And it always seems surprising to me that for decades, all there was to the west of North Bridge, from the Lawn Market to the grand developing new town, was a boggy track that was apparently known as Georgie Boyd's Mud Brig. And Alexander Kincaid's map of 1784 gentrifies it as the Lawn Market Bridge, begun in 1783, following the decision by the town council to completely abandon the ornamental canal that had been an important part of Craig's proposal, and instead to fill where the canal was supposed to go with rubble from the new town's construction. And in fact, various schemes were proposed for the mound over the next half century, including this one shown on the right by Robert Kirkwood in 1823, which was for a centrally heated shopping mall with a central carriageway running here and then covered way south of the Royal Scottish Academy building that had been begun the previous year. So we jump forward in time, and by the mid-19th century, the old town, as we know, was in a dreadful state, a combination of population growth, immigration, financial restraints on building, and the steady emigration of wealthier inhabitants. And something needed to be done about it. And this map by the Edinburgh city architects, David Cousin and John Lessell, shows the proposed demolition of buildings in the old town to create new streets and improve sanitary conditions as required by the Edinburgh City Improvement Act of 1866. And they also illustrate the initial impact on Edinburgh's, the initial impact of Edinburgh's new medical officer of health, Henry Littlejohn, and his principle of piercing the closes with an airy street to let in light and ventilation. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves about Littlejohn. At the age of 29, he performed an impressive and original statistical analysis of the causes of death and morbidity in Edinburgh, underpinned by a coherent new set of sanitary districts. It was broad-ranging, but also practical and sensitive, covering things like housing and population densities, fresh water and sewerage, industrial pollutions, and so on. I'm a great fan of Littlejohn, and in the last couple of years, I found it hard not to feel we could have been in better hands with someone like Littlejohn in charge of public health, his understanding of society and culture, and the recognition of the links between poverty, employment, and public health. And Littlejohn was very keen to address inequality and extreme poverty in the Old Town. In 1865, the death rate in the Abbey and Tron districts was in fact double that in the New Town. But Littlejohn's relatively conservative aim of opening up specific overcrowded slums was developed into a much broader urban and architectural reconstruction projects due to the efforts of Lord Provost William Chambers. And whilst today we can walk along many of the new streets shown here that were created, this is another side-by-side view showing the Ordnance Survey Town Plan from 1849 on the right and 1849 on the left and 1876 on the right. These streets, St. Mary Street, Jeffrey Street, Chambers Street, they seem to have an inevitability as well as a long history behind them. But like all grand projects, it had many detractors at the time, and it was only partially implemented. The report proposed to displace 3,250 families, about 15,000 people. And even though a third of the forecast cost of 300,000 would be offset by the sale of new building stances along the streets, the remaining 2/3 were going to have to be funded by higher taxes over a period of decades. And even after much lobbying, the final scheme was only approved in the teeth of significant opposition. By May 1868, work had begun on St. Mary's Wynd, which was doubled in width by dint of removal of buildings on the east side and renamed as St. Mary's Street. The transformation of Blackfriars Wynd into Blackfriars Street proceeded along nearly identical lines. And the other major developments followed on in the 1870s, including the new Jeffrey Street curving down to Market Street. But not everything that we can see here was implemented. For example, the street over here to the east of Jeffrey Street never materialized, as well as the diagonal street we can see sloping up here along the lines of Stevenson's 1819 plan. The new Chambers Street that we can see boldly cutting across here on the right-hand side was really demolishing much of the former Argyle and Brown Squares at its western end, forming a new avenue by the Industrial Museum and Old College. In the press at the time, several people suggested the scheme was far more about Chambers wanting to gain his own place in history rather than any broader moral imperatives to reduce inequalities, certainly in this area. But that said, within 20 years of Littlejohn's report, the average death rate across Edinburgh fell by 32%, and the divergence in death rates across the city have been reduced by 38%. Now, Littlejohn's interest in health, community, and urban planning leads us on nicely to Patrick Geddes. And this stunning plan and elevation of the proposed National Institute of Geography in Edinburgh is important for illustrating several of Geddes' key ideas, particularly the importance of regional survey and geography for social evolution, as well as an exhibition of the relationships between the local community and its physical environment. The Institute of Geography was also intended to systematically arrange and exhibit the world's knowledge based on a geographical model. And Geddes is considered a founding father of town planning and urban regeneration. He firmly believed that in order to understand and improve an area, one had to be part of it. In the 1880s, he and his wife acquired slum tenements in James Court. You can see here just to the north of the Lawn Market, which he set about renovating. And then in the 1890s, he moved into Ramsey Gardens, just north of the Esplanade, with its commanding views of the new town. And we can see some of the changes between these two different ordnance survey plans. Geddes had seen the destructive effects of the Edinburgh city improvements of the 1860s with the significant demolition of historic buildings, and he advocated quite a different approach. He encouraged other residents to survey, plan, and improve the local environment through a project really of conservative surgery. The buildings past repair should be pulled down, but those that were repairable should be saved, and the gaps left by demolished properties made into courtyards and small gardens, as I'm sure many of you will know better than me. Many of these, either created in Geddes' time or inspired by his ideals, survive in the old town today. Geddes hoped this would encourage an influx of more affluent residents, allowing the development of a mixed structure and a healthier community. So the plan here was printed by Bartholomew and published in the Scottish Geographical Magazine of 1902 with a supporting note by Geddes, but for various reasons, a lack of funds, particularly the Institute was never built. Having said that, Geddes' enthusiasms and his influence continued unabated. He was invited in 1910 to create a cities and town planning exhibition in Edinburgh as part of the first international town planning conference. And this work subsequently traveled to London Dublin, Belfast, and to Ghent. And after the First World War, whilst Geddes spent an increasing amount of time abroad, he continued to exert quite an influence over town planning in Edinburgh. Geddes' son-in-law was Frank Charles Mears, who as an Edinburgh architect became one of Scotland's leading planning consultants from the 1930s to the 1950s. So given what we've seen already, maps and plans and the plans that they implement are wonderful illustrations in many ways of the well-intentioned damage that planners can wreak upon a town. And the final set of plans we'll look at this evening are those of the celebrated town planner Sir Patrick Abercrombie, who the council invited to visit Edinburgh in 1945 to collaborate with the local planning officer, Derek Plumstead. And Abercrombie and Plumstead saw themselves very much as professional experts and cities as requiring very much top-down management that it was the planner's mission to enforce, engineering the city into more efficient forms through new technologies, particularly the automobile. And this authoritarian, quite technocratic outlook was quite surprising, given that Abercrombie himself saw himself as a follower of minimalist, the more grassroots work of Patrick Geddes. And the report that they produced was actually entitled A Civic Survey and Plan. But after Geddes' death in 1932, Abercrombie was influenced by many other people, including modernists like Le Corbusier and the road traffic expert, Sir Herbert Elker Tripp. And the coloring on these maps very much illustrates the zoning principle behind Abercrombie's thinking and the influence of Tripp's precinct theory. Edinburgh was split into a set of zones: industrial, commercial, educational, residential, and recreational, that were intended to be safeguarded from outside influence. Traffic on communication arteries would be encouraged to reach their destinations as fast as possible without invading the precincts. And under their theory, Central Leith and Gorgie were to be redeveloped as industrial zones with their populations largely removed. Portobello developed as a seaside suburb, quoting them here to say reminiscent of Brighton, and other mixed and messy zones on the ground were steadily harmonized into one or other predominant type. But that said, Abercrombie's plan is a very impressive work. It's filled with optimism, vision, conscientious sincerity. It's got stunning thematic maps, and a large team compile very detailed geographical and statistical information presented as 25 hand-sketched thematic overlays on top of specially prepared base maps. These included things like population distribution, family sizes, dwelling conditions, historic buildings, and even things like road accidents. There's quite mind-boggling map shown here, which intends to compare road accidents in 1937 with road accidents in 1946. And I would say all maps are political, not just in the sense that they portray power relations, they zone rich and poor and winners and losers, but also because they encourage their readers to think and act in different ways to the world presented before them on the map. And Abercrombie firmly believes that a system of suitably designed dual carriageways was necessary and would become ever more so in future as wartime restrictions on petrol were removed and car ownership expanded. And the map shows his inner city ring road scheme. This incorporated a 3-decker Princes Street. The top story was intended as a service link road. The middle one had car parking, and then the lowest was for through traffic. And this through traffic thundered along underneath the Caledonian to a roundabout, and then continued to curve alongside the Meadows. There was then another roundabout, And then the dual carriageway bulldozed its way north to meet another roundabout again before going underneath the Royal Mile and then re-emerging on the north side by another roundabout, and then a route linked off towards Lee Street, and another then curved down towards the west to meet the Mound. And this area here is rather better shown by the model, a sideways model from the west, seeing that roundabout along the lines of Jeffrey Street, but on top of it, curving down gracefully on stilts in various directions, as we can see, with fluffy trees as well, just to enhance the appeal. And of course, we can breathe more than a sigh of relief that the scheme was never adopted, but it did continue to influence much post-war planning, not least in the idea of the outer radial of the city of Edinburgh bypass implemented in the 1960s. So what can we say by way of conclusion? Maps present, I think, the history of Edinburgh in one of its most enthralling forms, and collectively they provide a detailed graphic portrayal of the development of Edinburgh. But they can do much more than this. They often illustrate the differences between intentions and reality, between proposals and implementation, as we've seen this evening. They give us the imagined or the unbuilt Edinburgh that could have been. Maps celebrate the vision and ambition of particular people and institutions, but at deeper levels, they reflected the way people thought about the city, what was important to them at the time. It's important to remember too, that these maps also played their own part in creating the idea of Edinburgh as a great city and influencing the hearts and minds to think and act towards Edinburgh in a particular way. I think the unrivaled built townscape that we can enjoy today reflects something of the vision of these people and their ideas, even if sometimes we can breathe more than a sigh of relief that their ideas were often blocked before implementation. Thank you very much indeed for listening.